Graeme Innes.
Thanks, Peter, and may I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. I should start by setting the record straight. I think the sailing championships that Peter was referring to were the first World Blind Sailing Championships in Auckland in New Zealand, and we got the silver medal. So, but we did do a bit of partying as well. It's true of almost everything in life, clothes, relationships, jobs, etc., etc., that one size doesn't fit all. And I wonder if, to make sure that every member of our community has the chance to find a job in our community, we need to accept that one size doesn't fit all in the way that people find jobs. I've been pondering, as perhaps many of you have, how we can redress the huge balance that Peter talked about, that people with disability who are unemployed and seeking employment. And it seems that almost no matter what we do, we can't change those numbers. So I want to talk today about employers' positive favour of people with disabilities, because I think it's important to talk about that, whether you can positively discriminate, and if you can, how you might do it. So firstly, can you as an employer discriminate in favour of people with disability? Well, the answer is a resounding yes. The Race and Sex Discrimination Acts deal with discrimination against anyone on the basis of their race or gender, and they make it unlawful, with some minor exception, against anyone or to treat anyone less favourably on the basis of their race or gender. So, for example, a Scotsman can lodge a complaint of discrimination that the Human Rights Commission, with the Human Rights Commission, as can an Aboriginal person. And both men and women can lodge complaints of discrimination if they believe that they've been discriminated against on the basis of their gender. But the Disability Discrimination Act is quite different. The DDA makes it unlawful to discriminate against someone or to treat someone less favourably on the ground of their disability. Its purpose is to advance the opportunity of people with disability in our society, and it contains no equivalent provision barring discrimination against a person on the ground that they don't have a disability. So if an employer decides to set aside 20% of its graduate recruitment program for people with disability, it's not against the law. If an employer decides to create particular positions in their workplace for people with disability, it's not against the law. And if an employer decides to set a target or quota for the number of people with disability it will employ over a certain period of time, it's not against the law. In fact, the ACT government did this just a few months ago, and about that a little bit later in the proceedings this afternoon. So now that we know that we can positively discriminate in favour of people with disability, why should we do it, and how should we do it? Let's have a look at a YouTube clip made by the United Kingdom Disability Rights Commission. Let's just watch this now. There should be no need for positive discrimination measures in employment. If people with disability were getting a fair go in the first place, then this would be the case. But we're not. There's still a problem. People with disability are not getting jobs, and discrimination is continuing, despite people with disability wanting to work, many of whom are highly qualified. Despite employers professing a willingness to employ people with disability and a process in place to achieve this aim. Latest stats from the ABS, released 2nd May 2011, say this: while there have been significant improvements to support those with a disability in many parts of their lives, little improvement has been made in key areas of everyday life. The last 6 years, labour force participation remained low at around 54%, compared to 90% for people without disabilities. And Year 12 attainment was around 25% for people with disabilities, just over 50% for people without disabilities. So these stats and the following stories demonstrate that even if we are able to achieve equality in educational outcomes between students and with and without disabilities, or as the case may demonstrate here, even if a student with disability graduated with a university medal, the employment rate for people with disability would probably not change. This woman that I'm talking about is a woman with a significant disability. Not only does she have a law degree, but as I said, she has the university medal. She won mooting competitions and various other competitions in her employment in the public service. In her university employment. But she couldn't even get, let alone a job with the public service. My own experiences, which were some time ago now, but sadly I don't think the situation has changed much, are that I did 30 interviews in 1 year as a lawyer, 15 of which I probably wasn't the best qualified applicant, but the other 15, the law firms in question couldn't understand how a person with a disability could operate as a lawyer. And I took a job eventually as a clerical assistant in the New South Wales Public Service. I used to be a clerical assistant in the New South Wales Public Service with a law degree. And my job was answering the telephone and telling people the winning lotto numbers. I was made redundant from that job by an answering machine, but I've managed to progress a bit since then. My third story is that of a computer programmer with Asperger's syndrome. He's a great programmer, but he has poor communication skills, and he can't get a job because he can't get through the interview process. But if he was employed as a computer programmer, how many more times is he going to have to sit through a job interview? These stories are not atypical, and they're taking place every day in workplaces across Australia. The names, faces, disability types and stories may change, but the outcome is still the same. So what's happening? The stories and the clips that I've showed you highlight that the low employment rate is not necessarily related to educational achievement, and it's not related to ability. It's related to employer attitudes, lack of understanding, and the system that we're currently using. And I think we need to unpack merit selection and what's really happening during the selection process. And perhaps the Disability Rights Commission YouTube clip does that for us to some extent. We need to ensure selection criteria only contain requirements of the job and don't prescribe how a job must be done, only the outcome or output from that job. Apart from health and safety warnings and descriptions on materials, does a cleaner need to read? Are we excluding people with disabilities in the recruitment process? If initial testing of people requires completion of a written test at a computer and we don't have screen readers available, aren't we excluding people who can't see the screen? If interviews are conducted in an inaccessible building, aren't we excluding people with physical disability? And if interviews are not available with an Auslan interpreter or a hearing loop, aren't we excluding people who are deaf or have a hearing impairment? Further, I think we need to unpack what's happening during employment and what's prevented. We need to unpack what else needs to be done by all of us. And while we're doing this, we need to change the situation now. And we can do this, I think, by implementing positive discrimination measures, which, as I've said, are allowed by the DDA. Let's take recruitment. We could make a commitment to give every applicant with a disability an interview to discuss, which is something that's done at Vision Australia. And it allows real opportunities to demonstrate capacity that maybe didn't in the application, and it gives opportunities to practice interview skills and to process for the next job application to improve chances of success, even if the person's not successful. We could make a commitment to give every applicant with disability a real opportunity to demonstrate or discuss capacity to perform the inherent requirements of the job during the interview process. My experience was that I often wasn't asked questions about how I, as a person with a disability, would do the job. And I think it's really important for employers to ask those questions about disability, because if they don't, then they're making uninformed decisions. And I encourage people to always bring up the topic at the end of the interview if they're not asked. We could make a commitment that if an applicant with a disability comes close to being for consideration of barriers that people with disability experience through their career progression and work experience and opportunities, that the applicant with disability is offered the position. We can make a commitment that a proportion of graduate recruitment places are reserved for graduates with disability, noting that 20% reflects the number of people with disability in the general population, and just over 10% reflects the number of people with disability in the labour market. Recruitment targets for employees with disability could be set. As an example, the ACT government has just done this, and I won't preempt what we're going to hear on that later this afternoon. Apprenticeships, traineeships and work experience opportunities for people with disability could be created, or if your workplace has those opportunities and schemes, a proportion of those positions could be reserved for people with disability. For public sector employers, we could explore wider use of clause, this is Commonwealth public sector, of clause 4.3a and 4.3b of Public Service Commissioner's directions, which were introduced last year, and create a new mechanism for the employment of people with disabilities. It's important that any position that's designed is sustainable for a person with disability. Now let's look at career progression during employment. We could make selection for training opportunities more available for people with disability, selection for travel opportunities, mentoring, a comprehensive support and capacity building program could be developed for employees with disability from their managers, and this could include a specific pool of funds for training opportunities for employees with disability, and disability to be given the opportunity to be matched with a mentor during their term of employment. And finally, let's look at other things that we can do. Recruitment agencies contracted by your organisations as a requirement of their contract could be required to identify applicants with disability. This would have to be monitored to ensure compliance. You could continue to work with government to ensure that any employees with disability and their employers can have guaranteed access to support on an as-needs basis at any point of the employment continuum, and regardless of how the job was secured. And you could lobby government for the right to request flexible working arrangements being expanded to people with disability. Currently, the National Employment Standard restricts that request to parents and people with caring responsibilities for children under school age. Expanding this right to people with disability would enable people with disability to have the same right to request flexible working arrangements. And this has been law in the United Kingdom now for several years. I'm sure that there are many other things that you as employers can think of and do once we shift the paradigm of the merits principle and accept that it's okay to discriminate positively in favour of people with disability. So let's go back to questions. Can we discriminate positively in favour of people with disabilities? Well, to quote Barack Obama, yes we can. Second question, should we discriminate in favour of people with disability given the disadvantage that we experience and given the fact that we know we're not getting jobs? I think, yes we should. I'll be interested later to hear what you think. Thanks for the chance to speak.